A CEO whose hobby was sailing was taking some business clients on his yacht to wine and dine them and close some major deals. With expert skill, he sailed his sleek vessel into a secluded cove off a remote island and suddenly felt the ship lurch and run aground on a sandbar. He revved his engines full throttle, but the yacht wouldn't budge. He thought about radioing the Coast Guard, but his pride and business sense wouldn't let him. He knew the longer his guests were stuck there, the less likely he was to seal the deals. Grabbing his binoculars, he scanned the cove and saw a rust bucket of a shrimp trawler not far away. With his ship's horn, he gave a distress call, which the trawler responded to, making its way to the stranded yacht. The CEO came out of the bridge to the concerned guest with his winningest smile, a pitcher of margaritas, and a story he hoped they'd buy, and announced, "Nothing to worry about, folks. Just a slight delay. Although the nautical charts don't show it, this cove sometimes acts as a funnel for sand after storms come through. I've signaled a local shrimper who's coming to help us. We'll be back on course in a few minutes. Try my patented cucumber melon margaritas." He watched relieved as furrowed brows changed into wrinkled smiles. The rust bucket trawler chugged up alongside the glossy yacht, and the weathered captain with a sun-splotched face hailed the CEO. "Stuck, eh?" The CEO nodded sheepishly and asked, "Could you help me out?" "Aye, that I could, for a price of, say, $10,000, said the trawler's captain. $10,000, said the CEO. "Are you out of your mind? Why would I pay that to you when the Coast Guard will do it for free?" "'Tis true," said the captain, "but you and I both know the Coast Guard is 3 hours away. And while you may be that patient, I'm not so sure about your guest there." Thinking $10,000 a small price to pay to seal more lucrative deals, the CEO agreed. The captain threw him some lines, which the CEO attached to his yacht. The diesel engines of the trawler surged and pulled the yacht back out to open waters. As he handed the check over to the captain, the CEO said, "You know, at those prices, you can make a real living pulling people off day and night." "I can't," replied the captain. "At night, I haul sand for the bar." Stories of ships running aground and our reading from John's Gospel have something in common. Let's take a look. Broken dreams, shattered hopes, forsaken expectations. We've all experienced them, haven't we? Idealism comes so much easier when we're younger, doesn't it? As teens, we dream big dreams and imagine a better world and the role we'll play in it. We hitch our hopes to the stars and set a course for that distant horizon where we'll make our dreams a reality. The future is unlimited when we're younger. The possibilities are endless as we sail forth. But something happens to that sleek and shining dream. It becomes shipwrecked upon the razor-sharp rocks of reality. The educational path we had chosen and invested time and years in turns out not to be the path for us, and we're shipwrecked. That career we had hoped would go the distance gets downsized and outsourced, and we're shipwrecked. That relationship where we had promised till death do us part ends in divorce, and we're shipwrecked. A pension plan we had counted on for retirement gets looted. An investment portfolio's value plummets. A health insurance policy we need gets canceled, and we're shipwrecked. Forsaken expectations, shattered hopes, and broken dreams. Each of us have experienced them. As a guide for those who have been shipwrecked, we need look no further than Peter. In this primal apostle, we'll find lessons in life that apply to us individually and congregationally. Out of his experience of broken dreams, we'll discover how hope can be rebuilt and our lives restored, not just on a personal level, but a congregational level. Probably some of the most poignant verses written in John are these. Gathered there by the Sea of Tiberias were Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples. Poignant because after their thrilling 3 years of discipleship with Jesus, the place they return to after they're scattered in fear is home. The ones who left their fathers like eager puppies on an adventure now return with tails tucked between their legs. The ones who once thought they'd feast like kings with the Messiah in his Jerusalem palace come back home to Galilee, eating humble pie. The ones who once left with heads held high in confidence now return with gazes directed toward the ground. Jerusalem is too dangerous, so they cut and run back home to Galilee. Can you imagine the snide comments, the knowing looks, the wry smiles that must have come their way as they sought to justify their 3-year absence? No doubt they moped around a bit, aimless and confused about the future. They were home, but now what? More poignant verses follow as Peter says, I am going fishing. And they said, we'll go with you. Those who had left their nets for good to chase a dream of God's kingdom came back only to pick them up again. I wonder how heavy those nets must have seemed, weighed down beneath a crushing load of lofty dreams destroyed. They returned to the only work they'd ever known, as if their 3 years with Jesus was just a fevered daydream. Peter, not one to mope around, takes action and goes fishing, and others join him. John tells us that night they caught nothing. Night and darkness in John symbolize separation from God. Indeed, they're living out these words of Jesus from John 15:5, where he says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Apart from me, you can do nothing. They return to their former profession, but find no success. They're washed-up fishermen whose dreams of discipleship have become a nightmare. One lesson for us who have been shipwrecked by life is to go home in humility. One place as individuals and congregations to begin again, to start over, is at home. Maybe there's another way to look at this decision to return home, however. Perhaps we shouldn't view it in such a negative way. After all, it is the place where Jesus first called them 3 years ago. It could be they're going back home to get their bearings once more, to see if there are any echoes of that still, small voice that called them to fish for people. After their disorienting disaster in Jerusalem, they return to reorient their lives in Galilee, in the place where Jesus had first called them. As Peter Gomes of Harvard Divinity School explains in the Good Book, there is in Celtic mythology the notion of thin places in the universe where the visible and the invisible worlds come into their closest proximity. To seek such places is the vocation of the wise and the good. And those who find them find the clearest communication between the temporal and the eternal. Perhaps the reason the disciples return to Galilee is to be in a thin place where they can hear God clearly communicate once more. They have, wittingly or not, placed themselves to be in a position ready to receive whatever might be forthcoming. And wouldn't you know it, a stranger appears. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but they didn't know it was him. The resurrected Jesus travels incognito. The identity of the light of the world is hidden from their eyes. Did you notice the change from night to day, from darkness to light? Just after daybreak is more than simply the sun rising in John's symbolism. It signals we've entered a new realm, a thin place where God speaks to us if we but listen. The stranger tells them, "Cast the net to the right side." So they cast it, and in doing so, caught an enormous number of fish, 153 to be precise. In contrast to the night in which they caught nothing, obeying the voice of God in the day, they have a miraculous catch. Maybe they obeyed this command to cast the net because on this very lakeshore, 3 years ago, they had fished all night and caught nothing. And a carpenter appeared and told them to cast their nets in the deep water. And they caught so many, their boats began to sink. Perhaps their decision to return home has a silver lining, that of placing themselves in a thin place to hear God speak. A second lesson for us who have been shipwrecked by life, either individually or congregationally, is to find thin places, then listen and obey. The willingness to listen leads to further obedience. The miraculous catch of fish isn't the point of this story, but rather the restored relationship of Jesus to his disciples. It's going to take more than 153 fish to do that. After all, they'd already seen another miraculous catch of fish, which had led them to become his disciples. But that relationship has been ruptured and needs to be repaired. That's what we see him doing by the charcoal fire. He tells them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught. Come and have breakfast." It's not enough to catch 153 fish, but rather to bring what he's given them to him. And here's a note of grace. Even before they bring the fish to him, he has already prepared breakfast for them. Even before they caught the fish, even while they were fruitlessly fishing in the dark, Jesus had prepared a meal for them. And not just any meal, this one has a special symbolic significance. As John 21:13 says, Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. Does this remind you of any other meal Jesus shared during his ministry? One perhaps involving 5 loaves and 2 fish. As John 6:11 says, Jesus took the loaves and distributed them and the fish. John's wanting us to remember the feeding of the 5,000, whose miracle wasn't the numbers fed, after all, but that Jesus was able to reveal himself by saying, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. These 7 disciples on the lake shore are now understanding the fullness of those words, eating the bread of life with the one who has risen from the dead. The resurrected Jesus has invited them to share a meal with him and to know him more fully. Their willingness to listen leads to further obedience as they bring the fish he gave to them and receive a meal already prepared for them. He's working to restore their relationship to him through their bringing fish to him and them being fed by him. This is a third lesson for individuals or congregations starting over and beginning again. Bring what you have and receive what you need. There's one more step for restoration to occur. One final rupture must be repaired, and this is the one between Jesus and Peter. You remember Peter, the one whose mouth wrote checks his body couldn't cash. Even though I must die, I will never deny you. When Peter said this, he did so believing in the strength of his own character, but in the darkness. In the darkness, he denied Jesus not once, but 3 times, around the warmth of another charcoal fire. Fear choked the life out of his love for the Lord. And without his love for the Lord, there could be no discipleship. He had severed that relationship of love with his 3 denials. Under Jewish law, all a man had to do to divorce his wife was to say, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, in the presence of witnesses, and that relationship was over. In one sense, Peter had divorced Jesus there in the presence of the courtyard witnesses. Not just saying he didn't love Jesus, but that he never even knew him. Peter never even uses the name of Jesus in his denials, only saying him or the man. So it's interesting to hear how Jesus refers to Peter in his 3 questions. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? No longer does Jesus call him Peter, the rock, but Simon, son of John. Jesus isn't referring to Simon anymore as Peter, but at least he's not calling Simon him or the man. Simon had distanced himself from Jesus, and Jesus acknowledged that distance by not calling him Peter. Peter was the name that Jesus gave to Simon once he had become a disciple, but that relationship is ruptured. There's a relationship that needs to be repaired, and Jesus asked him, do you love me more than these? These could include more than these nets and fish. Do you love me more than your former profession that you had tried to take up again? These could include more than your fellow disciples. After all, hadn't he insisted that although the other disciples might desert Jesus, he never would? These could also include more than any actions. It's of paramount importance that we hear the question of love coming first, prior to any charge of feeding and tending sheep and lambs. Love of Christ comes prior to service to Christ. Let me repeat that. Love of Christ comes prior to service to Christ. If the love isn't there, the service won't follow. It can't. We saw that in the courtyard of Peter's denials. Without the love of the Lord, there can be no discipleship. Love of Christ comes prior to service to Christ. But the service, the tending and feeding, flows out of that prior love. Whether individually or congregationally, loving is prior to serving. The last step to starting over and beginning again is to love and then to serve, in that order. Jesus gives Peter and us a chance to undo the divorces we've enacted through our denials. And let's face it, we've all denied Jesus. Maybe not so dramatically, but certainly as repeatedly in the words we speak, the choices we make, the actions we take, the attitudes we share, and the thoughts we think. Our dreams of discipleship are at best fantasies, at worst nightmares from which we cannot awake. For all of us whose dreams have been shipwrecked on the rocks of reality, Jesus invites us to wake up to another reality. For Jesus sees in us a basic goodness we don't see ourselves. And Jesus doesn't want us to go through life boxed in by our denials, thinking we're less than we truly are and can be. Jesus comes to all of us who have been washed up by life so that we can start over and begin again, whether as individuals or as a congregation. We can begin again. Thanks be to God for Jesus, who shows us that God is a God of more than second chances. Amen.